I know that for months I have been absolutely barren of ideas, completely unable to work up anything sellable. Then the man Conan seemed suddenly to grow up in my mind without much labor on my part, and immediately a stream of stories flowed off my pen, or rather off my typewriter, almost without effort on my part. I did not seem to be creating, but rather relating events that had occurred. Episode crowded on episode so fast that I could scarcely keep up with them. For weeks I did nothing but write of the adventures of Conan. The character took complete possession of my mind and crowded out everything else in the way of story writing. When I deliberately tried to write something else, I couldn't do it. That is from a letter written by Robert E. Howard in December 1933 to fellow author Clark Ashton Smith about his most famous creation, Conan. Conan the Cimmerian. Finally, here on the Robert E. Howard Show, we are talking about Conan. Conan, at long last. So, welcome, my friends, welcome to stately Von Manor and the Robert E. Howard Show, where we are talking about Conan the Cimmerian at long last. Conan, by far Robert E. Howard's most famous creation. If you know Robert E. Howard, it's probably because of Conan. Even though Robert E. Howard wrote a whole bunch of different stuff and many different adventure characters, Conan is certainly his most successful and important character. He wrote the most stories about Conan. The Conan stories, by and large, are his best set of stories. Really, really good stories, the Conan stories. Just excellent pulp adventure, and a fascinating character, actually, the character of Conan. You'll see from that little bit that I read you there that it sounds like he just popped up magically in Robert E. Howard's mind, and Robert E. Howard was just relating these adventures almost as if they were told to him by Conan himself. Robert E. Howard made a real effort to make his work seem effortless. Really, he put a lot of work into Conan, and it wasn't as easy as he made it sound. And you can tell that right from the beginning of the Conan series. The Conan series grew out of the King Kull series. And in fact, the first Conan story, The Phoenix on the Sword, is a rewritten King Kull story. It was By This Axe I Rule, which I did a video on a few weeks ago. But he replaced the character of King Kull with the character of King Conan, and it took place in the Hyborian Age, a much later age, about 10,000 years before recorded history, if I'm remembering correctly. And the character of Conan is very different from the character of Kull. It's an interesting way to start the series, because in the first Conan story, Conan is already a king. We see that he has reached these great heights. He is a king of the greatest nation of his age. He is king of Aquilonia. And so the very first story takes place with him being a king. And some of the earlier Conan stories do take place when Conan is a king. But they jump around an awful lot. In one of the other earliest stories of Conan, he's a young thief in the streets of a Hyborian city, which is the story, The Tower of the Elephant. Excellent story. But we get just a teenage Conan in that one. And all of the Conan stories jump around in time. And so they are not told chronologically. And that's an interesting way to do it. Eventually, a picture emerges as you read these stories of a character who wandered down from Samaria, a northern country, Samaria, a barbaric country. The Sumerians are barbarians. And Conan is one of the few barbarians who ever leaves Samaria to travel to the more civilized kingdoms. And he does this as a teenager. And he starts off, the lowest of the low. He's just some thief. Eventually, through his intelligence and his strength and his fighting ability, he becomes many different things. He becomes a pirate. He becomes a mercenary. Eventually, he becomes a general. He becomes a bandit leader at one point. And eventually, through his own strength and ability and intelligence, he becomes the king of Aquilonia. It's a heck of a rise, So he starts at nothing, basically, and ends up being, about as successful as anyone can be, really. And so it's a great story of this guy who just, becomes successful through his own efforts. And along the way, fights a lot of monsters and has a lot of incredible adventures. So it's a terribly entertaining series. This series is a lot of fun. And the rise of Conan is an interesting story. And how Conan became popular in the real world is kind of an interesting story in itself. Conan as a character was all but forgotten after the Pulp era for a while. Robert E. Howard, as a writer, he didn't expect to ever achieve any lasting fame in his lifetime. And by the end of his life, which was early, he died when he was 30 years old. And it was by his own hand. So he didn't really think that his writing would ever amount to much. It earned him a living while he was alive. And he thought that's all it ever would be. But Robert E. Howard was an incredible writer. He was an immensely talented writer who was able to focus his tremendous imagination and his natural storytelling abilities and just write stories in a way that nobody else was writing them. He was the greatest pulp writer who ever lived. And his stories, they languished for a bit. They were reprinted by Arkham House. Arkham House reprinted some of Robert E. Howard's stories in a volume called Skullface and Others. And the Conan stories were reprinted in the 50s, I believe, by Gnome Press, to moderate success. And the science fiction writer L. Sprague de Camp actually edited those and added to the Conan series, with his own pastiche version of Conan. Conan didn't become really popular, until the late 60s, I believe, in the 70s, when Lancer published the paperback Conans. And they became a great success when the versions with Frank Frazetta's artwork, Frank Frazetta's covers, burst on the scene. And that made everybody notice these books, because those covers were incredible. And so people started to read Conan again, and Conan became incredibly popular. And Robert E. Howard's writing was rediscovered through these Conan paperbacks. A lot of us have fond memories of this series of Conan paperbacks. But there were issues with these Conan paperbacks. For one thing, it wasn't enough for L. Sprague de Camp to just edit these stories. Like I said, he felt like he needed to add to this series, to make the series longer, And he got help adding to the series from another writer, Lynn Carter, Lynn Carter famous for writing like everybody he could think of. He wrote stories. Uh, he wrote pastiche Edgar Rice Burroughs stories. He was already writing pastiche Robert E. Howard stories. He wrote pastiche everything, and so he worked with L. Sprague de Camp to write new Conan stories. L. Sprague de Camp also did this other thing where he would take stories written by Robert E. Howard that were not Conan stories and turn them into Conan stories and added that to the series. He also rearranged the stories in the chronological order of Conan's career, which it's an odd thing to do. It would be like doing that with Sherlock Holmes. You know, it'd be like Sherlock Holmes, which was another character whose stories were not told in chronological order. They jumped around a bit in Sherlock Holmes' lifetime. Nobody really thinks of taking the Sherlock Holmes stories and putting them in order of Sherlock Holmes' career. Well, that's not true. Baring-Gould did that. But there's no reason to do that, really. The best way to present the Conan stories, I think, is in the order that Robert E. Howard wrote them. But that's not the way L. Sprague de Camp did it. He did it this way. And this way he could stick his stories amongst Robert E. Howard stories. And the problem is if you were a casual reader, you weren't going to, unless you were paying attention to the contents page, you weren't going to know who wrote what. Which is a problem, because Robert E. Howard's dead, and he has no say in this, you know. So a lot of us had problems with that. Those of us who are Robert E. Howard fans, we had issues, you know. For a lot of us who are Robert E. Howard purists, and I'm one of them, we think that the only person who could write a real Robert E. Howard Conan story was Robert E. Howard. Pastiche Conan's okay, but don't try to pass it off as the real deal, you know. And so that was a problem. For many years, Robert E. Howard's original Conan stories, as Robert E. Howard wrote them, were not being published. They were all these versions that were edited by L. Sprague de Camp. In some instances, things were changed by L. Sprague de Camp. And his stories were all mixed up in this series. Fantasy writer and editor Carl Edward Wagner started to come out with a series of authorized editions that were the unedited Conan stories, but he didn't get past 3 volumes. There were rights issues at this point. Eventually, all of the Conan stories entered the public domain. And now we can read them as they were originally written. Now, in the meantime, while all that was happening, Conan became famous not only because of these paperback books, but also because of the character as he was presented in the Marvel comics. There was a Marvel comic book version of Conan. And that became enormously popular. And that is how actually most of us found out about Conan in the first place. That's how I found out about Conan. I knew Conan when I was a little kid as a comic book character. And I loved that comic book. It was a well-done comic book. And that's how I knew Conan. And I didn't find out that he was a literary character until much later. Now, fortunately, at long last, we can read Conan as Robert E. Howard wrote Conan. Now, there's a lot of different editions that you can find Conan in. Some are better than others because, you know, he's in the public domain now. The original Conan stories are. So anybody can reprint the original Conan stories, and anybody does, particularly if you're buying them as ebooks. There are a lot of print-on-demand outfits that are publishing the original Conan stories. But the best edition of the Conan stories is the edition published by Del Rey, which is this edition right here. They were published in 3 volumes by Del Rey. This is the first one. This is The Coming of Conan the Cimmerian. The second volume is The Bloody Crown of Conan. And the third volume is The Conquering Sword of Conan. And if you're going to buy Conan, this is the edition I recommend. All of these texts are the original texts as they were either written or originally published. So these are the unedited versions of Conan. This is the real deal. Also, every scrap that Robert E. Howard ever wrote about the character of Conan is in these editions. That cannot be said for most, if not all, of the other editions that are out there right now. This has everything. All the stories, all the fragments, everything that Robert E. Howard wrote about Conan, they're in these volumes. Also, they're very beautifully illustrated. So yeah, and they're still readily available. They were printed a number of years ago, but they're still available. So, you know, get these if you're interested in Conan. Great set of volumes. And Conan was a really interesting character. Most people think of Conan as a savage barbarian who probably isn't too bright. Part of this is from the film versions of Conan, the Arnold Schwarzenegger films, where, to be fair, he doesn't come off as the brightest character in the world. And those films, while being entertaining, I really liked the first Conan movie. Not particularly close to the character as written by Robert E. Howard. One thing about this character of Conan is that he was a smart guy, and he was really, really good at what he did. He was a good general. He understood warfare and fighting. He understood the politics of his age. He was successful at what he did because he was so smart and strong and an incredible fighter. But you can't underestimate this character's natural intelligence, which shines through in these stories. In fact, the first time you ever see Conan in a story, he isn't fighting. He's sitting at a desk drawing a map of the countries that most maps didn't have, the northern countries where Conan was from, which is an interesting image and not the image you expect to be the first image of Conan that you get in the Conan series. Eventually, there's plenty of fighting and killing of monsters, but there's a lot more to Conan than that, which you will find out as we go through the Conan series. So that is just a little introductory episode on my Conan series from the Robert E. Howard Show. Be sure to catch me next week when we talk about the very first Conan story, The Phoenix on the Sword. And I will catch you next time.